friend. Well, today is day 6 of our decluttering challenge, and we are going to talk about our fantasy self and how that's relate to the clutter that we hang on to. So, have you ever thought about a version of yourself that it's like, someday I'm going to be that? So maybe there are some jeans that you're hanging on to that they don't fit you anymore, but someday you're going to fit back into those. Okay, that's that fantasy self, that someday. Or maybe there's books that you've never read. Now, I have to be honest, I have many books, a whole bookshelf probably full of books that I haven't read, but I still hang on to because I know, someday I will read those books. So that someday is kind of like our fantasy self. Or do you have art supplies or maybe exercise equipment that you don't use, but someday I will use that. Someday I will be the person that gets up every morning and exercises and uses all that equipment. Or I will be the super creative person that uses all of those wonderful art supplies and makes beautiful things. Does that sound like you? Now, these items may look very innocent, and it may just be, I can just get rid of them. But the reality is the underlying emotion, and the reason that it's hard to get rid of them is that these items represent fear and shame and guilt. That's what we're going to talk about today. So when we're talking about decluttering and people-pleasing, we have this fantasy self, this hoped-for self of someday. Someday I'll use that. Someday I'll wear that. Someday I'll be the person that needs that. But the reality is, we got to face reality. That isn't really who we are. And when we don't accept that, we can experience a lot of shame. And those someday items are kind of like a mask that we wear. Now, in people pleasing, we often wear masks and we don't show our true self to others. But when we have this sort of fantasy self, that's also a form of a mask. And what that mask is telling us is that we are not enough. And that if we just work harder, shrink smaller, becoming more invisible, or get more focused, then we'll be good enough. We'll be enough. But that's not true. We are enough already, just the way we are. You do not have to become someone else to be worthy of peace. Letting go of that someday clutter is not giving up. It's choosing who you are today. It's loving and valuing and honoring who you are today and knowing that that is enough. Okay, so now I want to tell you a story about a fantasy self that I had. Now, I have several fantasy selves with the books and the craft supplies, but this is another one that I had about exercise gear and diet books. So for a long time, I had a lot of exercise gear and different machines, treadmills and step machines and just all kinds of different exercise equipment. And I had diet books and I had articles on dieting. And you know what? I wanted those things to inspire me to get healthier. I had bought those things for very good reasons. I wanted to be healthier. But hanging on to those things and not using them was another way to just have this fantasy self. And what I wanted for that was to inspire me, but the reality was it didn't inspire me. It just made me feel ashamed of myself, feel guilty for buying all this stuff and then not using it. And so I needed to let go of many of those pieces of exercise equipment and to get really real with myself because I do want to be a healthier person, and that doesn't have to be a fantasy self. It can be who I really am. But I had to recognize that hanging on to the exercise equipment was not going to create this person that I wanted to be, that hanging on to it was just a way I was seeing that fantasy and that hoped for future. But again, it didn't really inspire me. It just made me feel worse about myself. So that's a story about one of my fantasy selves too, my fantasy selves. And if you can recognize a fantasy self that you have, please comment about that below. I would love to hear some of those things that you are dealing with too. So we can let go of that fantasy self, of that hoped for self. Because the reality is we do not need to keep punishing ourselves for who we aren't, but we can love and value ourselves for who we are today. Because the reality is who you are today is a pretty cool person. Even if you don't feel that, hear that from me. You are a good person and you have strengths and gifts. And we just need to focus on those. That's what I do a lot in my coaching practice. So we can let go of that hoped for someday fantasy self. Now, here is a way that you can do that. So take one thing that is part of a fantasy self or a hoped for self. For me, it could be some of that equipment that was in that exercise bin or some of that exercise equipment that I had. And take it and look at it. And thank it for what it meant to do. Because again, I had gotten these things with good intentions. And so we can take that item, we can thank it because it did have a purpose at one time, but to also recognize that if we are not using it, if it is not helping us become the person that we want to be, that we truly want to be, maybe it is just causing pressure in our life and guilt and shame. And if that's what this item is doing, you can let it go. But as you hold this item, maybe it really does inspire you. And you say, yeah, I really want to keep this. I really do want to become that person. I want to add that to the true self that I am. Then keep it. It's okay. It's your choice. You get to do that. But really think about what those feelings are around this item and trust those feelings, because so much of this is about self-trust. Honoring the emotions that come up around the clutter that we have, and then overcoming the people-pleasing to trust ourselves with what we really want to do with these items. You are allowed to stop trying to earn rest, approval, or worth. These are things that you already have, and you just have to choose to claim them. Claim those things in your life and let go of the hoped for one day fantasy self things. Okay, stick around because I've got my insight, affirmation, journal prompt, and action step for you today. Stick around. Okay, friend, so here are the insight, action step, journal prompt, and affirmation for day 6, the someday story or the fantasy self story. All right. So the insight, again, this is what we've been talking about in this whole video, but the insight is someday items often keep us tied to fear or to fantasy. The reality is fantasy is not the truth, and we need to face the truth of who we are, because that really is good. Mostly good. There's so much good in you and so many gifts and strengths that you have. I know that's true. Okay, so the affirmation is, I trust myself to meet my needs when they arise. And so we don't have to hold on to all of this someday stuff or this fantasy self stuff. We can trust ourselves that when I am ready to do something, to become that person, then I will do it. And hanging on to the stuff, it doesn't make us become that person. It just holds us in guilt and shame. Okay, the journal prompt is, what am I afraid will happen if I let go of this item? So letting go of the item does not mean you're letting go of the desire to change or improve yourself. When you are ready to do that, you will do that. And hanging on to this stuff isn't going to make you more ready. Okay? And then the action step is release 2 to 3 just in case or someday items. You can do that. All right. Thank you so much for being here today. If you'd like to connect, all of the things we've been talking about in this challenge are things I help women with in my coaching practice. And so I'm going to leave the links below. And also, if you want more of this 15-day people-pleasing and decluttering challenge, I will leave videos on the screen and in the description below. All right. Thanks so much for being here today. Bye-bye.